A single press conference, a single paragraph in a newspaper, and the fate of roughly 300,000 American soldiers, the men of the Ninth Army, suddenly hinged on a question of command and pride. January 1945. In a cramped Allied press room, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery spoke with the blunt confidence that had become his trademark. He described, in unmistakable terms, what had happened during the Ardennes fighting. The northern push had held, he argued, and British and Commonwealth forces had played a decisive role. To many American ears, his words sounded like a claim, an assertion that the British had held the line, and that, implicitly, his command merited expanded responsibility. The press carried the remarks like dry tinder into a powder keg. For a coalition already strained by the immense costs of the Bulge, the comments detonated resentment and alarm. For Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, the moment was more than an insult. It threatened to rip the fragile seams of coalition command when unity was most necessary. Omar Bradley, commander of the U.S. 12th Army Group, bristled. George S. Patton, impatient and instinctive, saw the episode as yet another affront to American pride and initiative. The question that would follow was not merely about credit for a campaign long fought. It was about the authority to command American formations going forward. If Montgomery were to be allowed to retain control of American armies permanently, what precedent would that set for U.S. commanders and for alliance politics? If American commanders resigned in protest, what would become of the integrated war effort? Stay with this story. The stakes get personal, and the outcome shaped how hundreds of thousands of men finished the war. The immediate fallout was raw. Newspapers in the United States took Montgomery's remarks as an affront to the sacrifices of American troops, veterans of the Ardennes, many of whom had endured freezing nights, limited supplies, and the close, bitter fighting that produced tens of thousands of casualties, read the dispatches with growing anger. Omar Bradley saw more than wounded pride. He saw principle. For Bradley and other senior American leaders, command of American armies by an officer from another nation, especially after a public claim that seemed to diminish American contributions, was intolerable. Bradley used the most dramatic lever available to him, the threat of resignation, not as an idle gesture, but as a realistic expression of what could happen if the chain of command and national honor were perceived to be in jeopardy. To understand how explosive this was, one must remember what had brought Montgomery into temporary control in the first place. During the Ardennes counteroffensive, the German attack in December 1944 drove a wedge into Allied lines. In the immediate crisis, Eisenhower reorganized sector responsibilities to manage the emergency, temporarily placing the U.S. 1st and 9th Armies under Montgomery's 21st Army Group for the northern shoulder of the Bulge. It was an expedient move in wartime, a temporary adjustment to use available commanders and units most effectively against an urgent threat. It was not intended to be permanent. Yet Montgomery's subsequent public posture made permanence an issue. His private staff and public statements suggested a desire to keep the arrangement beyond the emergency, on the grounds that concentrating forces would allow a decisive northern thrust into Germany. His argument had a certain operational coherence. Concentrated command and unity of effort could, in theory, be more efficient for a major offensive. But the context mattered. To American commanders, the proposal threatened not only a shift in operational control, but a redefinition of how Allied armies would be led in the final phase of the war. It would be a profound institutional change, one that could reshape the last months of fighting and the post-war balance. Winston Churchill, watching the escalating dispute between his senior field commander and the American High Command, attempted a diplomatic middle ground. In the House of Commons and in private conversations, he emphasized the sacrifices of British and Commonwealth troops and the need for operational flexibility. His solution, palatable at first glance, recommended that the First Army return to American command while allowing Montgomery to retain the Ninth Army. It was a compromise that aimed to diffuse immediate tensions without forcing a humiliating public reversal. For Eisenhower, however, the compromise had a dangerous edge. If Montgomery retained the Ninth Army on an indefinite basis, the precedent would be set. A British field marshal could exercise long-term command over major American formations. Eisenhower had to weigh Allied cohesion against the imperative of preserving American command authority and morale. He understood the political dimensions intimately. He also understood the human cost that lay behind Bradley's fury. American soldiers and their families read headlines. They counted their dead. Some 19,000 American deaths in the Ardennes alone had been reported, and they demanded that their sacrifices translate into respect and proper national leadership over American troops.
Eisenhower's answer was a narrowly crafted but decisive addendum to Churchill's compromise. Instead of a permanent transfer, he allowed the Ninth Army to remain under Montgomery's operational control only for a single clearly specified purpose, the Rhine crossing, Operation Plunder. The limit was blunt and unambiguous: one army for one operation, a phrase that captured the balance he sought between coalition practicality and national prerogative. It solved the immediate political crisis by avoiding mass resignations and preserving the appearance of Allied unity.
It preserved the principle that American armies would not be permanently commanded by foreign officers, and it set a measurable condition. After the Rhine crossing, the Ninth Army would return to American command. That decision, austere and bureaucratic in tone, carried enormous human consequence. The Ninth Army at the time consisted of roughly 300,000 men: infantry, armor, engineers, support units, soldiers who had grown accustomed to their American structure of command. The distinction of who issued the orders might seem abstract at headquarters maps, but for those men it was concrete. Which supply system provided rations? Who signed operational directives? Who determined movement priorities? And ultimately, under whose flag would they finish the war? Command was not merely ceremony. It shaped the day-to-day reality of combat and the chain of honor that soldiers and officers felt bound to protect. Operational testing of the compromise came quicker than many expected. In late March 1945, the Allies converged on the Rhine, the last major natural barrier into the heart of Germany. Montgomery's Operation Plunder was a large, methodical plan, a coordinated crossing with engineers building bridges under fire, massive artillery preparation, airborne landings to secure flanks, and a deliberate step-by-step advance. Montgomery intended the Ninth Army to form the southern prong of that crossing, working alongside British and Canadian formations as part of a large, orchestrated push across the river between March 22nd and March 25th. But coalition warfare, by its nature, would not be constrained to tidy schedules. George Patton, commander of the U.S. Third Army, embodied a contrasting philosophy. Where Montgomery methodically planned, Patton relied on speed, initiative, and seizing gaps as they appeared. In a characteristic move, Patton ordered his forces to cross the Rhine at an opportunistic point a day earlier than Montgomery's grand timetable. The crossing was not a minor footnote. It was a vivid demonstration that a mobile American formation could exploit openings without the elaborate set pieces Montgomery favored. The juxtaposition was telling. Montgomery's carefully rehearsed operation went ahead, massive in scale, confident in doctrine, involving airborne forces, engineers, and meticulous synchronization. The Ninth Army performed its assigned role capably. Engineers pushed forward to construct bridges under fire. Airborne troops landed to secure key positions. Infantry and armor established lodgements on the eastern bank. The logistic and operational complexity of crossing a major river under enemy observation and fire is immense, and the Ninth Army's work contributed materially to the Allies' ability to pour forces into Germany. Montgomery, predictably, claimed the broader success for his plans. His staff envisioned further uses for the Ninth Army, arguing that it should remain under British-led coordination for continuity's sake. But the very continuity they advocated was precisely what Eisenhower had curtailed. When operational tempo slowed and strategic choices returned to the center, Eisenhower and Bradley insisted on the prior understanding. Continuity in the abstract could not trump the explicit political and military agreement they had made. Montgomery's ambitions collided with the limit that had been set months earlier in a tension-filled compromise. On April 4, 1945, the procedural consequence of that negotiation was enacted. The Ninth Army was officially returned to command under Omar Bradley's 12th Army Group. Men who had briefly operated under Montgomery's direction were now back under American command. For many soldiers, the change was administrative, orders signed by a different headquarters, different staff officers giving directions. For the American High Command and for the broader history of coalition warfare, it had deeper resonance. It reaffirmed the principle that national armies should, except in short-term exigencies, remain under their nation's leadership. It removed the danger that a single press conference and a string of operational conveniences might reconfigure alliance control for the final chapters of the war. The practical consequences of the transfer were evident in the weeks that followed. Under Bradley's leadership, the Ninth Army continued its advance into Germany, coordinating with Patton's Third and other American and Allied formations. It helped seal off pockets of resistance, linked up with Soviet advances in the East, and participated in the mopping-up operations that preceded Germany's collapse. The soldiers who had been affected by the command changes finished the war under the flag and leadership of their own nation, a fact that mattered to institutional leaders and to the men who had fought and bled. This was no mere matter of pride. The transfer avoided a rupture that could have had immediate and destabilizing consequences. Bradley's threat to resign was not an empty bluff.
Losing the commander of the 12th Army Group in the middle of a major offensive would have been catastrophic politically and operationally. Eisenhower's narrow and forcible compromise prevented such a fracture. It allowed coalition forces to retain the unity necessary to press the final offensives, while simultaneously safeguarding the integrity of American command and the morale of American troops. Yet the episode left larger marks on how coalition warfare would be viewed. It underscored the delicate trade-offs inherent in multinational command structures, the need to balance operational efficiency with national pride, the imperative to avoid setting precedents that could be exploited to reshape command permanently, and the enduring impact of public statements made by senior commanders. Montgomery had displayed organizational skill and the ability to coordinate complex operations.
He had also, through public assertions and an apparent appetite for a broader role, cultivated resentment. Patton had shown again that audacity and speed could achieve results that careful planning might not anticipate. Eisenhower navigated between these extremes with a political military judgment that kept the alliance intact. There is another human angle that should not be overlooked. The roughly 300,000 men of the Ninth Army were not chess pieces. Their sense of who commanded them mattered for identity, for unit cohesion, and for recognition of sacrifice. Many had been shipped from American states, trained under American doctrine, and worn the patch of U.S. forces with pride. To serve for an extended period under a foreign commander might have seemed a betrayal of that identity to some, particularly after the harsh weeks of the Ardennes, when casualties and endurance became the currency of respect. Eisenhower's limitation restored a degree of that recognition. It meant that the narrative of how those men finished the war, signing surrender documents, marching into liberated towns, meeting Soviet counterparts, would be narrated under American command, and in many ways under American judgment. The affair also illustrates the balancing act at the heart of Eisenhower's leadership. He was not a general who sought glory. He was a manager of an alliance composed of proud and sometimes competitive nations. His authority relied as much on tact and political acumen as on military judgments. In this case, his decision was not to humiliate Montgomery publicly, which might have driven a wedge between Britain and the United States at a critical moment, nor to accede to Montgomery's desire for permanent control, which would have provoked an American crisis. Instead, he carved limited space for operational necessity to be met, and then drew a firm line. The one army for one operation rule was a compromise precisely because it was limited, enforceable, and immediate. To call the decision consequential is not to suggest it decided the outcome of the European war by itself. It did not. But it did determine, quite literally, the command fate of some 300,000 soldiers in the closing months. The Ninth Army's return to American control on April 4, 1945, ensured that those men would finish the war under their national leadership. It prevented a precedent that might have allowed foreign command over significant American formations to become normalized. It kept senior American commanders in place at a fragile moment and protected the cohesion on which final operations depended. The episode also left a lingering lesson about leadership, ego, and coalition politics. Montgomery's brilliance as a planner and organizer was real. His insistence on maintaining control could be read as devotion to a single operational concept. But public claims that seemed to take credit in ways that diminished Allies' sacrifices were politically costly. Patton's impatience and willingness to exploit tactical opportunities affirmed the vitality of American operational culture, and Eisenhower's choice to impose a narrow, enforceable limit exemplified the kind of statesmanship that sometimes matters more than battlefield flair, a willingness to accept imperfect compromises to preserve the greater task. By early May 1945, as German resistance collapsed and surrenders multiplied, including enemy capitulations in sectors once contested by Montgomery's forces, the question of who commanded the Ninth Army had become a settled administrative fact rather than a touchstone of coalition tension. Yet for the men who had been under that army's banner, it mattered. How they crossed the Rhine, under whose plans they advanced, and to whom they owed their final orders, shaped the closing pages of their wartime experience. For the commanders, the episode became a case study in how leadership, timing, and public posture interact to shape not only strategy, but also the lived realities of soldiers. The closing, perhaps ironic, detail is that a conflict sparked by a moment of public rhetoric found its resolution in a matter of paperwork and timing, an agreement limited to a single operation followed by an administrative transfer on a single date, April 4, 1945. In that act, Eisenhower preserved alliance unity, maintained American command authority, and altered the practical trajectory of roughly 300,000 men who would finish the war under their nation's leaders rather than a permanent addition to another commander's force. History often remembers battles and borders, but it is decisions like this, the restrained, political military judgments, that shape how those battles are owned and how soldiers' service is recognized.
The press conference in January, the outrage it provoked, the diplomatic compromise from Churchill, and Eisenhower's terse addendum together rewrote the command map for the final months of the European War. For the Ninth Army and its near 300,000 men, that rewrite changed how their last months of fighting were commanded, how their sacrifices were acknowledged, and how, in the end, their story would be told. If you found this account gripping, there are deeper dives available on the personalities and operations we've touched on, detailed studies of Operation Plunder, biographies of Eisenhower, Montgomery, Bradley, and Patton, and first-hand accounts from soldiers of the Ninth Army. Subscribe and watch the related videos for the archival sources and maps that illuminate exactly how these decisions unfolded on the ground.